So on the day that Glen was intubated, he was really upset. They had him in a prone position with his arms over the edge of the bed, and he had this tiny little bit of tissue, and he was crying his eyes out because he knew being intubated gave him a high risk of dying, because we had looked at it, we had seen the statistics, and at that point we just felt like there was no other option, and obviously because the doctors were in control there was no other option. Couldn't leave the hospital with him, and he had said to me, I've got death cover and I want to be cremated, and it was really just too much. And I was saying to him...
And he was saying that as he was crying?
He was saying that it was as he was crying, and I was saying to him, I love you, honey. And he was saying, I know you do, baby. And he was saying, I just want to get this over with. I just want to get this over with either way. And he said, if it's only going to be 3 days, just do it, which led me to the impression that they had told him that he would only need to be on it for 3 days, but he knew.
How long was he on it in the end?
He was on it for 30 days. He was on it from the 25th of December to the 24th of January. 30 days to the day that he died.
Go.
Hi, my name's Kerry, and I'm here today to talk about my husband Glen, who died in hospital in Queensland from ventilator-acquired pneumonia. And excuse me, I must put my glasses on. Due to or as a consequence of COVID pneumonitis.
How it's been lately? Okay, we'll start again. First off, what's your name?
Hi, my name's Kerry.
And we're going to here to talk about the unfortunate passing of your husband. Who was he? And tell us something about him.
Okay, his name was Glen. He is an American. His dad was African American and his mum was South Korean. So he pretty much looked like an islander.
Wow.
And a lot of people called him Hawaii Five-0, basically. He was 6'2" tall. Wow. And it was amazing when we met because he didn't seem 6'2" tall when we were talking on Skype. So when I first met him and I looked up, I was like, wow, you really are 6'2". Yeah. And he had a big heart. He was really passionate about things going on in the world. He never really had a bad word to say about anybody. He was an amazing husband. He never, ever said a bad word to me in almost 10 years of marriage. Even when I was being a B, he wouldn't even call me that. And in fact, one time I called him a derogative name and he drew a clear line in the sand that was unacceptable and that he'd never speak to me in that way. And from that moment on, I guess I just knew that the way us Aussies speak to each other really isn't appropriate for some Americans, and he was one of them. But he had a big heart. He has an adult son that lives in Seattle, Washington. He took on my 5 kids like they were his own, and a couple of mine have given us a little bit of grief along the way, but he took it all in his stride and, backed me 100% in everything. And his wedding vows are a testament to the person that he was. He said he'd always put me first in every decision that he'd ever make, come to me with any concerns before anyone else, and he really lived to that standard to the day that he actually, the last words he spoke was his concerns about me, not for himself.
Wow. So before we get to even COVID, where were you, the both of you, before you'd even heard of the word COVID?
Where were we? So we were living in Cranbourne in Melbourne's outer southeast. And I guess, like everybody else, we saw the news flashes of people dropping dead in the streets. And my immediate thought was, hang on, that guy supposedly dropped dead in the street, but he broke his fall with his hands. That doesn't add up. And, you know, Glen and I discussed it. We started following the frontline doctors in America. So we were very clued on to what was going on right from the start. And, you know, both of us spent a lot of time researching things online and listening to a lot of people talk from, you know, various online platforms. We were censored a lot as well. We know that a lot of people that we were following were censored and some even disappeared. You know, and we did try to stay up to date with the latest advice. Obviously, we didn't trust the government because we felt like things like ivermectin that had been used around the world, particularly in third world countries where they were having great success, was all of a sudden banned in Australia and other places. So, you know, we were deeply suspicious of what's in this for the government. And then we sort of started to go down a few rabbit holes here and there and follow a bit of a money trail, and worked out there's some big players here that have investments with pharmaceutical companies and including our own governments. And yeah, so we were awake, and we really thought that we were safe in knowing what we knew, and we didn't think that we'd ever have to worry if we got COVID or that it was ever going to be a problem for us, I suppose.
What did you think when you were watching the things now, all the news stories coming out now, which basically vindicate you, that you're actually correct in your time?
Well, it confirms what we thought all along, is that for the majority of people, COVID is probably like a bad flu for some, because I felt I had it for 7 days, and the first 3 I was pretty sick. And
what were your symptoms?
My symptoms were a pretty severe headache, a very, very sore neck, very sore throat, and that was in the first 3 days. And then in the last few days I had a little bit of shortness of breath. I took my vitamin C, D and zinc. I upped all of those, and I took a bit of ivermectin, and by day 8 I felt okay. I still had a tiny bit of shortness of breath, but also I'd been laid out for the whole week, you know, just, you know, probably sleeping a bit more and not doing my usual routine. So I think anyone that lays around for a week probably struggles to get back into it, even if you have the flu. So that was how I felt. And
Did you have it first before him?
I did have it first. So I had it first. I was probably 3 days ahead of Glen. So just as Glen was starting to get sick, I was probably on my way to getting better.
Oh, I see. Yep.
Yep. So...
And did he get as sick as you straight away?
No, actually the first few days that Glen had it, he was only slightly sick. When he first tested positive, it was only because he had to go for an ultrasound on his shoulder, and they insisted that he'd have a rat test, and that came back positive. And I don't think he quite believed it, so he did a second one. And then because I was sick, he came back and asked me to take one just to see if it was COVID that I had. And then I tested positive as well. So his first 3 days, he wasn't all that... Well, he went from no symptoms the day that he tested to the following day he started to get a little bit sick. The first 3 days he wasn't really that sick, and day 4 he said, "Oh, I think I've beaten this." Then day 5 he felt a little bit sick again. Then and then progressively got a bit sicker up until day 8, where he started to have some breathing issues.
And was that worrying you?
that was worrying me. Look, we really didn't want to go to hospital. We knew about the ventilators, we knew about the way they were treating people in hospitals, and really it was a last resort. Glen was having some real breathing difficulties and coughed up a little bit of sputum, I would say, that he thought may have had a little bit of blood in it. So I guess I panicked and thought, I don't really know what to do now. He had taken some ivermectin, but we didn't have very much. I put a little bit of an SOS out online, and people said take ivermectin, but it was just, everything happened so fast. I just felt like he needed oxygen, so I took him to hospital.
What happened then?
So we got to the hospital. We walked in, the nurse seemed pretty blasé about things, and they were, asking him what was happening. Then they put the oximeter on his finger. I didn't see what the reading was, but I saw the look on the nurse's face. It looked like she panicked a little bit, so I guess his saturation levels were quite low. So I was giving all his information to the receptionist, and I turned around and he was gone.
Oh.
And I thought, where's he gone? And I thought, well, maybe he went to the toilet. There was no toilets around.
So he could walk?
So he could walk, but he was struggling, but he could walk. And then I thought, well, maybe he went outside. So I went and looked outside. He wasn't there. I came back in and I said to the nurse, I don't know where he's gone. She said, oh, no, we've taken him out the back. She said, you'll be able to see him soon. That's okay. So I sat in the waiting room and waited about a half an hour, and then the nurse came back and said, you're not going to be able to see him. We're taking him to the COVID ward, basically. So he at some stage went to the COVID ward. They advised me to go home because I wasn't going to be able to see him. And I was able to speak to him over the telephone, but he was still struggling with his breathing. And at that stage, they had nasal prongs on him for the oxygen, and they were also intermittently giving him an external oxygen through a mask. So he was having that for the first, I don't even think it was 24 hours, and then he went to the ICU the following day. So this was on the 14th of December he went to hospital, and the 15th of December he was admitted to the ICU. So following that, he started to do okay in the ICU. He was there for 2 days and they sent him back to the COVID ward. When he got back to the COVID ward, he rang me and he said, I've tried to tell them that I'm not doing very well, that I'm having trouble with breathing. There's a difference between the oxygen that they give them in ICU and the COVID ward. And he repeatedly tried to tell them that he wasn't getting sufficient oxygen and they needed to increase it, but they didn't listen. And they kept him in the COVID ward overnight, and the following day he was sent back to the ICU. So from there, they began to prone position him. If anyone doesn't know, that means they put you on your tummy. That's meant to help open up your lungs, and it's a part of, they like to move them around to shift things around in the lungs to, move the oxygen around, and I guess the fluid that's building up in the lungs. So they were prone positioning him. Initially that was helping to some extent, and he was really compliant. They said that a lot of people struggle with the prone positioning. It's uncomfortable to be laying on your tummy 18 hours a day, trying to have, nasal prongs up your nose for the high flow oxygen, and then intermittently with a mask and trying to hold that on your face at the same time. So over the next few days, that was an ongoing routine, and he was becoming more and more exhausted. They'd had put him on to dexamethasone as well, which is a anti-inflammatory, and which I believe is a part of the guidelines for Queensland Health. They also...
So this was a Queensland hospital, even though you're in Cranbourne, you were in Queensland at the time.
Sorry, we moved to... Sorry, I think I've jumped ahead. So we moved to Queensland in August.
Oh, okay.
And it was due to the mandates because Glen would likely have lost his job because of the mandates, and he got a position with the same company that didn't have the mandates in Queensland.
Oh, wow.
So same job, same position, same company, but there was no mandate in Queensland. So we made the difficult decision to leave behind family and relocate to Queensland because obviously, like a lot of people, you have to do whatever it takes to survive through this, and that was the decision that we made. So, yes, this was in a Queensland hospital. Okay, where was I at?
He was doing okay, but he was getting worn out on his belly.
Yes.
After a few days.
Yeah, so he was getting very, very worn out, intermittently going between the nasal prongs and the mask. And one of the doctors explained it in a way that it's like running a marathon and not getting any sleep and running a marathon again because you're constantly trying to, breathe through it's called an external ventilator, the one with the mask, and it's pretty much forcing air in against your will to breathe, and it makes you feel like you're suffocating basically.
Wow.
So most people can't tolerate it, and he struggled to tolerate it, but he really tried to because he really did not want to be intubated. And that was a concern for both of us. So this went on until the 24th of December. So he'd been in hospital for 10 days at this point.
Wow.
And the doctors called me aside for a meeting and told me that they were considering intubating him. At that point, I requested that he be put onto ivermectin, and I was told that wouldn't happen, that ivermectin doesn't work. And I was shut down very quickly in that regard. Not only was I shut down in that regard, I had several doctors following over the next few weeks that made snipes at me about ivermectin, even though I didn't discuss it with another doctor. I had one tell me it was horse paste, that it only became popular when Trump started banging on about it. And he said it in a condescending way, right up into my face. And I disputed that with him, and I said, I don't agree with that, because I know that it's been used widely for other things such as mosquito-borne illnesses like malaria. It's also been used for rheumatoid arthritis, and third world countries have used it as a prophylactic. And he said, no, but that's not for COVID. It just isn't going to work, basically. And I asked him, even if Glen was to die, they wouldn't consider giving it to him, and he said no, they wouldn't, even if it meant Glen would die. So that was cut off pretty quickly.
Sorry, let's say that again. Even if it was like the last course of action, he's dying, they still wouldn't try it.
They still would not try it. Not only that would they not try ivermectin, I had been put in touch with Professor Ian Brighthope, who is a professor of natural medicine and worked with the frontline doctors around the world and done research into COVID and various treatments. And he helped me to try to advocate for a mega dose of intravenous vitamin C, which was used at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne and saved a 40-year-old man there who had gone into sepsis and survived after this treatment. They would barely even look at the studies. I tried to show them studies. I tried to discuss it with every doctor. There was 8 doctors in the ICU on the treatment team. I discussed it at length with every doctor. I was shut down on every level. I also tried to advocate for a a large dose of intramuscular vitamin D. And the basis for that was that Glen is of African American descent, so he has a sedentary job, worked in an office. He'd also had a Whipple surgery 5 years prior, where he had half his pancreas, his gallbladder, and part of his small intestine removed, which often meant that he had a lot of stomach discomfort and nausea, and sometimes couldn't eat. So,
And why did that happen? Did he have an infection before?
he had a cyst on his on the head of his pancreas.
Okay.
So, but it wasn't cancerous, so it was a non-malignant or benign tumour. So had that removed, all of that removed as a result. So he had to take enzymes to help break down his food, but he was quite often sick and had to fast for several days in order to recover from the discomfort and nausea. So I had concerns around him being vitamin D deficient because of all of the above, and also vitamin C deficient. So I had to really push for him to have the blood tests to test his levels of vitamin D and C, which initially they weren't concerned in doing and hadn't done. And this is, almost a week into being in hospital. And even when they did finally agree to do these blood tests, it took 10 days to get the results back. And when I asked what the results were, they said they were normal. I said, what does that mean? They said, on the low end of normal, so I'm assuming he was deficient. And even though he was deficient, they would only agree to supplement him through his feeding tube. They would not give him an intramuscular vitamin D injection or the vitamin C, not even a lower dose, like not even a 1 milligram dose twice a day intravenously to potentially save his life. And I had doctors condescending to me. I had doctors scream at me.
Scream at you, why?
Well, the first doctor that actually screamed at me was because I demanded to know what treatments he'd been given since we were separated when we got to the hospital.
Yeah.
And he asked, what treatments did you want to know about? I said, was he given remdesivir? And he said, well, I didn't personally give him remdesivir, but he was given remdesivir in the COVID ward, because once they come to the ICU, we don't give remdesivir because generally it's... Sorry. Generally remdesivir is given, there's different protocols under Queensland Health Guidelines. So if your saturation levels are under over a certain level, whether or not you're vaccinated, so you don't get remdesivir if you're vaccinated, but you do get it if you're unvaccinated. So he said that he did have remdesivir prior to coming to the ICU.
Yeah.
So I said, oh my God, no wonder he's so sick. And he started screaming at me and pointing his finger into my face and saying, the reason your husband is so sick is because he didn't bother to get vaccinated, and he was really angry. And I said, well, excuse me, then why am I not on that bed with him then, if that's the case? Because guess what? I'm not vaccinated either, and I recovered in 7 days. And this same doctor had also had a snipe at me in that meeting saying, and by the way, ivermectin doesn't work. And I said, so in the midst of him screaming at me, I said, and I'd hate to tell you too that I took ivermectin as well, and I'm fine. And I recovered in 7 days. So,
Screaming at you.
And not only did he didn't just scream at me there, he continued to scream at me. This was in a little room, to the point where I said, I'm done talking to you because this isn't going anywhere. I said, get me the head of the hospital.
Is he an old doctor, a young doctor?
He was probably, I would say he was about a 40 to 50-year-old from an Indian background doctor. And so I demanded to speak to the head of the hospital. And I walked out, basically. He said, fine, and I said, fine, and out I walked. And I walked back towards my husband's room. And
You were allowed to see him then?
at that point I was. So the first day I couldn't see him at all because he was in a COVID ward. Once he went to the ICU, I could see him through the glass because he was in a isolation room, so they have big glass doors. Everyone has to have their full, PPE and everything on. And
That's what you were wearing?
there was some conflicting ideas on whether I should wear full PPE or not, but in the end, I just had to wear like an apron. Look, I had different people challenge me on it at different times. Why aren't you wearing gloves? Why aren't you, you need to be wearing the yellow, the full PPE one. And then the infectious diseases team ended up saying, no, she can just wear the apron as long as she washes her hands. There's like a little room that you go into before the isolation room. So in there, I had to, gown up, basically. You had to wash your hands as you get into the ICU. Then you had to wash your hands again as you go into the room, and then when you leave the room, there's so many times you have to wash your hands, and Anyway, so basically, I didn't have to wear the full PPE in the end, but I did have one nurse in particular that gave me a really hard time and about, spreading infections around and that I should be wearing the full PPE and, whatnot. But no, in the end, they didn't make me do that,
And so did you meet the head of the hospital?
No, because this doctor then came... So I'll backtrack a little bit, sorry. So I had talked to him about the intravenous vitamin C in this meeting and the vitamin D. And I talked to him about the guy at the Alfred Hospital who'd had that treatment under the head of the ICU there who had gone out of his way to talk to the people at I think it was the Flora Institute, and he initiated for this man to have the mega dose of intravenous vitamin C, which was an initial dose of 30 milligrams over a 6.5 hour period, and then another 30 milligram dose, and then ongoing lower doses until he was out of intensive care. So this guy went on to survive. Not only did he survive, he was out of the ICU after 12 days and off the ventilator, and home with no complications after 22 days. Wow. So that was Professor Ronaldo Bellomo, who had advocated for that. So when I dropped his name, this doctor eventually followed me down the hallway and said, sorry, can we just stop for 1 second? So I had also mentioned Professor Ian Brighthope, who was the person that made me aware of what had happened with the mega dose of intravenous vitamin C that had been used by Professor Ronaldo Bellomo at the Alfred Hospital. So this doctor then followed me down the hallway and said, what was the name of this doctor that you're speaking to? So I gave him his name, and he said, okay, can I have his number and I'll speak to him? And I said, well, when I was given his number, it was given to me on the proviso that I was going to respect it. Yeah. So I intend to do that, and but I'm happy to ring him and you can speak to him. But unfortunately, I couldn't get hold of him on the day. He was in a lot of meetings. So then we talked a little bit more about Professor Ronaldo Bellomo, and he said, I know him. and he said, look, I tell you what, I will try to contact him, and if he thinks that this is something that will work, then I'd be happy to advocate to the hospital board for Glen to have that treatment. And then he came back to me and he said, well, I don't know him personally, so I don't have his number, and I haven't been able to get his number, but I've spoken to another number of, prominent people, doctors from around the country, and that they don't think that it's a good idea. So, basically we'll just supplement him in his feeding tube if it comes back low, if his levels come back low, which they did. So basically, I'm not even sure what dose they gave him in his feeding tube, but clearly it wouldn't have been enough, and it would have been too late to have any significant impact on his condition. So I'm not sure where we're...
So you're up to, he's in an isolation ward, you're allowed to go in, you're trying to get him to have vitamin C intravenously, and I think it's about day 10?
It is, yeah, it is about day 10. So, well, day 11 was the day that he was ventilated, and that was pretty much when I really did start to advocate for it. So I've probably muddled it up a little bit. So day 11 he was ventilated, which was Christmas Day. It was the day before Christmas that they started to, put that idea in my head, oh, we're probably going to have to intubate him. And so they did ventilate him on Christmas Day. Glen was at a point where he was that exhausted, and he said to me, I've got death cover, and I want to be cremated, and I was really upset.
Oh my God. He was preparing for it.
He knew that he knew that intubation probably meant that he wouldn't survive. We had read a lot of things about it, and unfortunately when you get into the hospital's hands, it's basically their decisions that count, not yours. It even got to a point where I was saying to the doctors, I'm his wife, I'm his next of kin. You should be listening to me and what I want. This is what he would have wanted. You're prepared to let him die. You're prepared to use treatments that aren't proven because they're on the Queensland Health Guidelines, but there's other treatments that have been proven, but because the powers that be won't allow them to be published, you're not prepared to let him have those treatments, even though other people around the world have survived with them. You'd rather let him die. And they basically said to me, look, we need to get the social worker to come and have a talk to you about decision making. So the social worker came and had a talk to me about decision making and said, look, when it's in an emergency situation, the hospital basically trumps you as wife and next of kin. And what I didn't know is that Glen had actually given me power of attorney over his medical decisions on the day that he was admitted to hospital, but nobody bothered to tell me that.
Wow.
Which is I only found out through the coroner's findings.
Wow.
When the coroner had reviewed Glen's medical records, it's come back that Glen had given me medical power of attorney. So I would have had more power than I knew I had, and actually accepted that I was just a next of kin and wife, and that I didn't really have the power to overrule them, or that they had the power to overrule me, basically. So I was left feeling pretty powerless in that moment. And right along the way, right along the whole way, I think it was probably every second day I'd call for a meeting with the doctors and demand for treatments. And this is while he was in a coma. I could see him deteriorating. I could see that, you know, they were switching around his medications. They didn't really seem to know what they were doing, and even their explanations to me really verified to me that they don't really know what they're doing. They just try a bit of this and try a bit of that and hope for the best, while there's treatments out there that have saved lives and could have saved his life, but they just weren't prepared to touch it. I even went into one meeting with one of the registrars, one of the consultants. So the consultants are the ones in charge of the ICU on the day, and the nurse in charge on the day. And it was the nurse in charge on the day that said, Kerry, they can't go outside of Queensland Health guidelines because they could potentially be deregistered if they did that, which I knew that. It was, but the doctors didn't. They neither agreed or disagreed. They just stayed silent. But their silence was enough for me to know that they really feel stuck as well. They have to follow the protocols that are put in place, and that's all they have to work with. And people are dying as a result.
So, he's on the ventilator. What happened there?
So ventilated on the 25th of December. You know, I kept trying to advocate for the vitamin D and the vitamin C. I never brought the ivermectin up again because I'd been ridiculed, and even some conversations that I had among nursing staff, which I'd never name, but it became pretty clear that I was almost like the laughing stock, and that basically other people had come into the hospital who were vaccinated as well and had ended up just like Glen, and yet the doctors would sit around and say Glen is in the position that he's in because he's unvaccinated, yet other people have have passed away or become seriously ill even though they're vaccinated as well. But I felt like I was the laughing stock just in the comments that were made by some of the doctors, and especially in the way that some of it was said. And there was one particular professor who on many occasions, you know, through telling me what was happening with Glen and making little snipes at me along the way. On the one hand, he'd be saying, we're doing this and we're doing that and this is what's happening. He's not really responding like somebody that wants to get well, like he had a choice. And then in his next breath, he would say something like, just because some people think some treatments work when they don't. And he said this after telling me that Glen had a 30% mortality rate on this particular day, and I was really gobsmacked. I was quite stunned, and because this professor was so rude to me on several occasions, I couldn't cry. I wanted to cry. My eyes were bursting. I just wanted to scream and yell and cry, but I held it in and I walked off, and I went and sat on the steps that led out of the hospital and just sat there, and I just...
It's been so fucking frustrating.
It was so frustrating. There was just nothing I could do. They wouldn't listen to anything I had to say, basically. And I watched my husband deteriorate. I had to fight. Some of the nursing staff were fantastic, I've got to say. Some of them really tried to help advocate for things for Glen. But, I mean, overall, I mean, they're all complicit. They're all still working there. They're all still putting in those treatments that they know, and I can tell from the conversations I'm having along the way that they already know he's not going to make it. And I could see it. I advocated to be able to be a part of doing his body washes, which some of the staff were resistant to, and I felt it's the least I can do. It's the least I can do. I want to do something to help my husband. And they had physiotherapists coming in, doing exercises with him, but in the event that he recovered, because if he had have recovered, it would have been a long road. You know, he would have had to have intensive physiotherapy to learn to walk and do everything again. So I really wanted to make sure he was getting as much of that exercise as possible. So the physiotherapist taught me how to do the exercises, and I tried to do it as much as possible. And, you know, even though I've got my own injury, which I do believe made it a little bit difficult. I had to do it from a sitting position to make it easier on myself. But I really wanted to be a part of his care. But, you know, things like lifting up his arm, I could see the muscles wasting away and his skin hanging. I mean, he was a solid 6'2" African-American male. And to see when you lift up his arm, he was practically skin and bone. And to see he had edema in his eyes looked like they were going to bulge out of his head, basically. And I really felt like they're killing him. And I was in regular contact with Ian Brighthope, and he came into a Zoom meeting with me with the doctors on the 29th of December. And that just went nowhere. They pretty much just laughed at him.
They laughed at Dr. Brighthope?
Professor Brighthope. Yep, they pretty much laughed. What are your qualifications? Have you worked in a COVID ward in an ICU? You know, so you're a professor of natural medicine. Like, what do you know, basically? That was their overall attitude. And it ended up in a screaming match. And, you know, Ian was so passionate in trying to help me with Glen, because I guess even more than I did, he knew what the outcome was going to be if they didn't give him any of those treatments. He knew exactly. He's done so much research into it. And even though I felt like I was aware, it's when you're in that emergency situation that you really realise how you're only partially aware. I hadn't done enough research. I didn't know what doses to do. I actually considered bringing in ivermectin. I actually went online to try to get ivermectin.
I was wondering that, whether you're going to sneak it in.
I actually tried to get some, but there was just one guy that was overseas, and I thought by the time it gets here it's just going to be too late, so I didn't even know if I could trust him. I thought, you know, is it just another scam or something like that? And, you know, I did consider doing those things, but I was also terrified that I would do something that would be the thing that killed him as well. So one thing I kind of discovered along the way was that I'd listened to all this advice from various people talking over the years, but I really didn't know what protocols to follow. And I think if anyone could learn anything from this, it would be, you know, be prepared to have things ready, have ivermectin, and if it's zinc that you're meant to take it with, and how much, what is your weight, how much, because it's my understanding now that it is by weight, not just take 2 tablets a day or, you know, that kind of thing, and also probably works better with some antibiotics as well. And I think Professor Ian Brighthope is probably a person that would know the answers to that, and I don't want to say that he is, because I don't want to speak on his behalf, but he's been a big help for me in I would have never have even known about this mega dose of vitamin C. And other things that I think is important for people to know is that when you get to the hospital, you could go for any reason, and they'll give you a PCR test, and if you test positive, you're going to the COVID ward.
Yeah.
And I've seen that happen to other people now. I've met...
Yeah, me too, I've heard that.
Since?
Yeah.
And they will treat you for COVID before they'll treat you for the actual reason that you went in. you'll be separated from your loved ones, and you won't get that chance. If you're given remdesivir because that's the protocol, you're not going to be in a position to tell your loved ones whether you've given them power of attorney or what treatments you do or don't want. And I know in Queensland hospitals, there is a form that you can get to say that you want to give medical power of attorney to particular people. You can fill that out when you get to the hospital. There is also a form that you can get to say what treatments you do or don't want, or medications you do or don't want. So people need to be aware of those things and make sure their loved ones are aware, and probably more than one loved one. Because, for example, if you were in an accident together and you'd nominated your husband, well, if both of you end up in that situation, who then acts on your behalf? So I think they're important things that I didn't know about, and I didn't even know I had medical power of attorney until after he died. And if I had have known, I would have made a hell of a lot more noise than I did, even though I feel like I made plenty. But I was just ridiculed. I was treated differently. They started to say, no, you can't come in during handover, kicking me out during handovers. No, you can't stay when we're doing his turns. If I went out, it seemed like there would be prolonged reasons why till I could come back in. I did have one nurse in charge when she came back from being away. She was actually really good. She actually said, if you're made to wait for more than half an hour, I want to know about it, and I will make sure you come back in, sooner. I was able to complain about one nurse that I felt was consistently rude to me, and that left me out one day for 2 hours waiting to come back in with no explanation as to why. Every time I buzzed in, I was told, no, they're busy in there, you're just going to have to wait. And that happened 3 times before I finally was allowed to come back in, and then to find out they needed to change over the ventilator. A simple explanation, when you're going through that already traumatic process and you have nurses speaking to you like that, which the majority didn't, it was only a couple, but I feel like it made the situation a whole lot worse. I felt angry and resentful, and and I didn't want to be that person in there swearing or yelling and screaming and making a fool of myself. I wanted to, act appropriately while still advocating for my husband. But there was times where I did swear. One of the times was 2 days before he died. Because they made it so difficult at times for me to be there, I developed a little bit of a routine where I'd go in the afternoon and I'd spend several hours in there with him, and I knew the drill. I knew when they were going to kick me out and how long I'd have to stay out for. So every day I went home for a couple of hours around dinner time. I'd come back after 8, after they'd done his 8 o'clock turn, because I wasn't allowed to be in there. And then I'd stay for a couple of hours. So on this particular night, I got there and there was a nurse who turned around to me with her arms crossed and said, it's outside of visiting hours, you're going to have to make this quick. And I said, why? And she said, like I said, it's outside of visiting hours, and if we make this for you, we're going to have to do it for everybody else. And I continued to question her why, and that's the only response I kept getting. And I said, oh my fucking God, I don't even know how long my husband's got, and you're going to make a big fucking scene about this now. And then another nurse said, look, if you're going to swear, we're going to have to ask you to leave. And I said, well, tell her to mind her own business. I've been doing this every day. Nobody's had a problem with it for weeks. And all of a sudden, you're going to kick me out. And anyway, I'd had a chat the day before to the nurse in charge who had agreed with me that I could spend some alone time with Glen without nurses watching my every move and listening to everything. I felt like I had things that I needed to say,
Yeah,
and there's a strong belief along many people that they can still hear you.
Yes.
And you know, I'd gone in on
So
this.
he was in a coma by now.
He was in an induced coma.
Yeah.
So when they ventilate you, they put you in an induced coma.
Okay.
So he had also. They initially had him on midazolam, and they had him on fentanyl, and there was another one. It was from the Rohypnol family, and but they said I can't remember the name of it, but that they said that it was so that, you know, he doesn't remember all the traumatic things that are happening if he recovers, and he was also paralysed, so they've had him on paralysis medication to keep him paralysed, because apparently when you're ventilated, if you're not paralysed, that can put your breathing out of sync with the ventilator, and if you start to wake up, it can actually cause more damage to your lungs. So they paralysed him as well.
Sounds horrific. So how your next thing is that he passed away?
Yes, well, what happened was on the 24th of January,
So this is a month later. So it's a month
later. A month later. So during the course of all of this, I also initiated what's called Ryan's Rule in Queensland. So Ryan's Rule is meant to be where you can. So when you invoke Ryan's Rule, it's meant to force an independent review. So I tried to invoke that like fairly early into his ventilation. I wasn't happy with the way the treatment was going, so I rang up Queensland Health. No, sorry, I didn't ring Queensland Health on that occasion. I spoke to the doctors, because that's the process. You have to speak to the nurse in charge and the consultants to tell them that you want to invoke Ryan's Rule. So I did that. I had a meeting with them, and the doctor on the day said, "Kerry, you're just trying to approach this in a different way. It doesn't mean you're going to get a different result. Do you realise that when you do this, it's going to come back to us, and we will be the ones that will do the review?" And I said, "Well, what's the point of it if it's not independent?" And she said, "Well, you've got every right to do that, but I'm just letting you know that that's what will happen." I said, "Well," she said, "So do you want to do it or not?" And I said, well, what's the point? If it's just going to come back to you guys, you've already made your decision on how to treat him, so why would I bother?" Then I spoke to another nurse who said, "Well, that's not necessarily true. Other people have invoked Ryan's Rule, and it has, it has changed the course of the treatment." So I thought, okay, well then I'm going to do it. So a couple of days later, I rang Queensland Health. I said, "I want to initiate Ryan's Rule. I don't believe he's getting the appropriate treatment. I've been advocating for treatments that he's been denied, and I want a review." So I rang them at about 7:30 in the morning. They said they will then get in touch with the hospital, and they will speak to the doctors, all the doctors will need to meet and have a look at Glen's treatment plan and review it. By 11 o'clock that morning, I received a call from, I don't know if it was a receptionist or someone from the hospital. Anyway, someone from the ICU. I think it was one of the nurses in charge, actually. I received a call from them saying, "The doctors want to see you for a meeting." And I said, "Well, I've just gotten out of the shower." And they said, "Well, if you can't get here before 12 o'clock, they won't be able to see you," basically. So I don't know when they were notified that I'd invoked Ryan's Rule. But it seemed to me if they'd already made their decision by 11 o'clock and they were also doing their rounds during the morning, I don't know when they did a review.
Yeah, that's right.
There was no review. There was just like, "Oh, here she goes again." And that's exactly what it felt like to me. And basically they said, nothing's going to change. And the day before he died, so the 24th of January, the 23rd of January, because he died on the 24th of January, 23rd of January, I contacted the health ombudsman to say, I feel like he's really deteriorating and I've been pushing for these treatments and I want you to intervene. They basically told me that there's nothing that they can do, but they'll do an investigation and they'll let me know the outcome, which I didn't find out for weeks after his death. They suggested that I talk to the hospital liaison officer, which I did, and she said to me, okay, I'll speak to the doctors, they'll need to do a review and they'll probably want to speak to you. So when I got to the hospital that day, I was told immediately the doctors want to speak to you. So I went and had a meeting with the doctors and I was asked, is there anything that you'd like to know? I said, yes. Why won't you give him the mega dose of intravenous vitamin C? Clearly he's deteriorating. Clearly what you're doing isn't working. And if you don't do something different, he's going to die. And she said, Kerry, you've gone around this with every single doctor in the place. We've talked about this at length and it hasn't gone anywhere and nor is it going to go anywhere. Anyway, a bit more back and forward with that. And she said, okay, well, I'm not on tomorrow. Another consultant is on. I will organise a meeting with him to talk about the possibility of the intravenous vitamin C. I left that meeting believing that there was some hope. I went back to the room and there was also the nurse that was looking after him was in that meeting with the doctor on the day. Went back to the room and within a short period of time, he increased all his medication. So at that point he was on double dose morphine, he was on midazolam, he was still paralysed, he was having nitrous oxide in a vape into his lungs, and the one that is from the Rohypnol family as well, that all went up from, I think it was 20 milligrams an hour to 25 milligrams an hour. And I said, why are you doing that? And he said, oh, we just want to make sure he's not in any pain. And the physiotherapist had come in and done a whole lot of chest work, pushing on his chest and everything, and his saturations levels dropped, which they had done the previous day as well. And they were struggling to get his oxygen saturation back up. Anyway, like I stayed for a few hours, longer than I normally stayed. I had my daughter and my grandchildren at my place and I thought, I'll go home and I'll have dinner with them and I'll come back because I expected that they would get it back up. I got a call at 8 p.m. saying, you need to come back to the hospital. We don't think he's going to live for more than a few hours. I got back to the hospital and they'd put all his medication up again to 30 milligrams an hour. And clearly at that stage I could see that his hands were going cold, his feet were going cold. And I was pretty distressed. But in the back of my mind I thought, why have they put all his medication back up? And it was a different nurse looking after him by this point and a different doctor. It was just the registrar because the consultants aren't there at night, just the registrars are. Anyway, I think, during that time, I've lost a daughter before who died in a similar palliative care type situation and a sister. So I knew what I was seeing. I knew that he was, his body was starting to shut down. And, over the next few hours, he was very sweaty, he was very clammy. Parts of his body were cold and parts of it were hot. He had a temperature. I opted for them to turn around the monitor because it was very stressful looking at the monitor, seeing everything that was going on. And, over a 6-week period in hospital, you get to understand a bit of what's happening. So, his heart was under a lot of stress and things like that. Anyway, the few hours turned into pretty much all night, and I think it was at about 4 o'clock in the morning. I felt like he was suffering even though he was in a coma. His eyes were literally bulging out of his head.
Were they open?
They were open. His eyes were wide open, but they were so swollen and red. And it was obviously like he had edema, and I could see this little... They had his head tilted on one side. I kept seeing this little tear rolled down. He had a tiny little bridge of his nose with his little African American nose, and the tear would roll down across his nose and down his cheek, and I thought, he knows he's dying, and he knows what's going on. So I said to the nurse, is there anything that you can do to speed this up, because I don't want him to suffer? So they got the doctor to come in and speak to me, and I really struggled with it. It took me hours to really make the decision. It was back and forward because I didn't want to be the one to do it, and I didn't want him to suffer either. And then he had his son who lives in the States, and I felt like he should be a part of the decision-making process. So I said, look, we need to get his son involved in the decision-making. I think it's only fair that we make the decision together.
Yeah, it is fair.
And so the doctor had a discussion with Vincent, and then we had a discussion together and opted to turn off the oxygen, which a part of the reason I decided to do that was because I was told that he'd been deprived of oxygen for so long now that even if they could fix his lungs, he would be, but basically he would be so brain damaged that he wouldn't recover anyway. I never would have made that decision had I have thought there was any possible chance. So we opted to do that, and he passed away quite peacefully. Within 5 minutes of them turning it off, he passed away. So, and then I was able to spend, a few hours with him. I was able to jump in the bed with him and lay with him. I was able to actually cuddle him, which I couldn't do for 6 weeks. And they were able to put his arm around me, and I lay on his chest. It was really difficult to leave. Didn't know it was going to be the last time that I saw him. And then, so I probably stayed for about 4 hours, and, he had his birthday during that time as well. On the 5th of January, it was his birthday. And I got
a Capricorn.
A Capricorn. And I got all his friends and family to send me messages of things, of birthday wishes and messages of support. And I cut out, with my grandchildren, we cut out love hearts and wrote the messages, and my granddaughter and grandson decorated them, and we put them all over the hospital wall. And so I was able to take all those things down, and the staff were quite good on the day, helping me pack everything up and giving me time. They took his handprints and things for me and his son to keep. And then came the next part, which was wanting an autopsy. So obviously I went through the coroner, and the coroner did a review of all Glen's medical records and said that Glen died of natural causes due to COVID, and there was no need, and that the hospital acted appropriately with all his treatment, and that a lot of the treatments that I had advocated for were experimental. So even though the treatments they were giving him, the treatments that I believed actually helped to kill him, were experimental as well, which seemed perfectly fine to them. But as long as it comes under the World Health Organisation and Australian Government and Queensland Health Guidelines, it's fine to give people lethal cocktails of whatever you like, as long as they've signed off on it, basically. Something natural like vitamin C's, It's on their list of guidelines.
Yeah, this is a thing in America now. Doctors aren't allowed to even prescribe it now.
No, and it's on Queensland Health's guidelines. Do not use for the treatment of COVID vitamin C, vitamin D, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine.
It's on their guidelines.
Zinc. It is actually on their guidelines. Do not use. Do not use. So, you can't use a natural treatment, but you can use,
Big harmers.
the big harmers, the ones that actually help to slow down people's breathing and everything as well, which seems to really contradict why you on a ventilator and then you're given double dose morphine and midazolam and things like that, which is, to my understanding, suppresses your breathing, and I requested an autopsy, which was denied. I then was told if I wanted an autopsy, I would have to get somebody independent to do it, which ended up being Royal Brisbane Hospital. So he was transferred to Royal Brisbane Hospital, where I spoke to a guy from there who said, I don't understand why you want an autopsy. You're not going to find out anything different to what you already know. And I said, well, I want to know everything. I know what I know, but I want it on paper. So I want an autopsy. And he said, you do realise what we're going to do to him, don't you, in having an autopsy? We are going to cut him open and we are going to dissect his organs. Do you really think that's necessary? I said, well, he's dead, isn't he? I said, and how else am I going to get the answers that I'm looking for? And then, he really, through the course of the conversation, he really tried to deter me from having the autopsy. And I said, look, I'm going to talk to Glen's son in the States and I'll get back to you tomorrow to give you a definitive answer whether we want the autopsy or not. But I already knew that I wanted it. So I rang him back the following day and he said, I thought we already went through this. I said, well, we did. And I said, and we've decided, as agreed, that we want to have an autopsy. And anyway, he said, so what do you want? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, what tests do you want? He said, because we're really only going to look at his lungs. And he said, the other things, we're not going to be doing that. And I said, well, I'm not medically trained. I don't know. I thought you'd have the answers to that. And he said, well, we don't do that here. You're going to have to get an independent person to do that. He said, what tests do you want for a start? And I said, well, I think I'd be wanting blood tests and urine tests and, liver samples and things like that. And he said, well, where do we put them? Do we put them in the freezer? Do we put them in the fridge? Do we leave them out?
He's asking you.
He's asking me. And he said, what colour caps do I put on them? I said, I don't know. I don't know anything about that. And he said, well, exactly. And then I said, well, look, I'll try to find somebody that can help me with it. And so I did find somebody that doesn't have the facilities to actually do the testing. So he's tried to advocate on my behalf. He ordered the samples, which are still sitting on ice at Royal Brisbane Hospital. And basically nobody's prepared to touch it. So I've spoken to this other person today who is going to have... He's reached out to a number of people who either don't get back to him or don't want to touch it, basically.
Everyone's scared.
They're a part of it or they're scared, or both. I don't know, to be honest. He seems to be the only person that seems to care about what I need. Anyway, so what he's agreed to do is, because we can't, I was told by this person at the Royal Brisbane Hospital that we're not a storage unit. So we can't leave them there forever. So he's going to have them couriered to Melbourne and they are going to store them for me until we can find someone that's willing to test them.
Wow.
Because I do believe that there's a lot more to Glen's death than he had COVID, and you know, the treatments that they've given him, I believe, contributed to his death. I don't believe that, and I believe they knew that all along. I do believe that. A number of conversations that I had leads me to believe that anyone that's gone in with Glen's condition in that particular hospital has basically left via the morgue. So I think they knew all along. And I also have had it explained to me that there are twists and turns along the way with COVID, that, you know, on certain days when certain things happen, you can basically know that that person is at a very high risk, and there's some simple tests that they can do to know that this person is a high risk person of dying, you know, or running into severe complications. And I don't believe that they did all those tests either, and I certainly don't think that the protocols that they used would ever have saved him, and I think they contributed to his death, and that's what I aim to prove. I know that it's going to be a time thing. I know that there's nothing I can do now to bring him back, and I'm hoping by sharing my story that other people will think about, you know, what would I do if I was in this position? What can I do? Who can I go to? It's great to be listening to things online and having an awareness, but you need to also know, you know, what treatments will work and how can I access them. If I go to hospital, everything is going to be taken out of my hands unless I put these things in place. And even then, are they going to listen to me? You have to know those things. And I've also spoken with Charles Coves, who is a former lawyer, who has some forms on his site that people can fill out to have that power of attorney and have that prior to needing to go to hospital, because it's easy to say, I never want to go to hospital. We said that too. I said it. Glen said it. But when push came to shove and he couldn't breathe, what were we going to do?
Absolutely. I think that's a great place to end it. Is there anything else you want to go off your chest?